I was 32 years old the night my brother dragged me across a ballroom floor to present me as a punchline. His fingers dug into the pulse point of my wrist, pulling me past tables draped in imported silk and towering floral arrangements that smelled faintly of gardenias and wealth. Flashbulbs burst around us, capturing the sweat on his forehead and the tailored seams of his tuxedo. We were standing inside the Belle Meade Country Club, the crown jewel of Tennessee high society. I was supposed to be seated at a drafty table near the kitchen doors, out of sight, but Preston needed a prop. He stopped abruptly in front of a man holding a crystal glass of bourbon. Harrison Caldwell owned half the shipping logistics networks in the American South. He was also the father of the woman Preston was marrying. Preston flashed his signature smile, the one that had secured him millions in venture capital for his telehealth startup. He gestured toward me with his free hand. Harrison, Preston said, projecting his voice over the string quartet. I want you to meet my sister Beatrice. This is our family failure. My parents materialized right behind him. My mother Caroline offered a light musical laugh, smoothing the front of her designer gown. We try not to brag about her, she added. She just does little computer projects. Nothing like Preston's vision. My father Richard took a slow sip of his drink, nodding in agreement. They waited for the billionaire to share the joke. They waited for him to validate their hierarchy. But Harrison Caldwell did not laugh. The silence that fell over our small circle was immediate and suffocating. Harrison lowered his glass. His gaze moved from Preston's eager face down to my cheap clearance rack dress and finally locked onto my eyes. He stared at me for 5 long seconds. So it is you, Harrison said. His voice was quiet, lacking any trace of amusement. This is unexpected. Welcome to Luke Vengeance, where we share stories of quiet resilience and the moments the truth finally balances the ledger. How old were you when you realized your family was never going to change? Drop your age in the comments and subscribe. Now let me tell you what happened when the laughing stopped. Preston blinked. The practiced confidence on his face slipped, revealing a brief, sharp flash of panic. His grip on my wrist loosened just enough for me to pull my arm away. Sir Preston stammered, stepping forward to reclaim the narrative. I just meant it as a joke. Beatrice is just... You can stop talking now, Harrison interrupted. He did not raise his voice. He did not break eye contact with me. He swatted away the golden boy of Nashville tech like a buzzing insect. My father stepped forward, his jaw tight. Harrison, I think there is a misunderstanding. Beatrice is just a data tech. Harrison handed his bourbon to a passing waiter. A data tech who builds better architecture than anyone in this room, he corrected. My mother let out a short, confused breath. Preston stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. The reality of the moment was failing to process in his mind. The sister he had spent his life stepping on had just been recognized by the titan he was trying to worship. Harrison gestured toward the open French doors leading out to the golf course. Walk with me, Beatrice. He turned and headed for the night air. I looked at Preston. The color had drained from his cheeks. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I smoothed the wrinkled fabric of my sleeve, turned my back on my family, and walked out the door, leaving them standing in the silent wreckage of their own punchline. The terrace air was crisp, laced with the scent of wet Bermuda grass and distant rain. The heavy French doors clicked shut behind us, severing the humid noise of the ballroom. Harrison walked to the edge of the patio. He rested his hands on the stone railing, his knuckles pale in the moonlight. He looked out over the rolling greens of the golf course. I kept my distance, my posture neutral. Powerful men always need a moment to recalibrate when the person who solved their impossible puzzle does not fit their mental profile. 2 years ago, Harrison began. His voice carried the steady rhythm of a man used to dictating terms. The Southern logistics grid went dark. A coordinated ransomware strike hit our central dispatch. Every freight manifest, every truck route, every warehouse inventory vanished behind a cryptographic lock. The federal cyber units gave us a recovery timeline measured in weeks. We were hemorrhaging capital by the hour. Cargo ships sat anchored in the bay, freight trains idled on the tracks. I remembered the event clearly. It dominated the local news cycle for days. I was working the graveyard shift at a regional data center in downtown Nashville, monitoring server temperatures to pay my tuition at a state university. During that same period, my parents were co-signing a loan to cover the losses of Preston's second failed application launch. While Richard and Caroline bought my brother another chance to play the visionary founder, I was drinking stale coffee under flickering fluorescent lights, watching the cascade failure ripple across my monitors. And then Harrison continued turning his head to look at me. At 3 a.m. on a Thursday, a patch arrived in my chief security officer's inbox. No name attached, just a generic email address and a string of executable code. It did not try to break the encryption. It built a ghost route around the infected sectors, hijacking secondary nodes to keep the freight moving while the main system sat in quarantine. It was elegant. It saved my company nearly $500 million over the next 5 days. I kept my gaze steady on the dark tree line. The ambient light from the ballroom cast sharp shadows across Harrison's face. I did not write that ghost route for glory or a financial reward. I wrote it because watching a network collapse makes my brain itch. I mapped the dead zones, stitched the working nodes together, sent the file, and went back to eating my cold sandwich. I assumed my anonymity was secure. My security team spent 18 months hunting for the architect, Harrison said. The outsourced data center had terrible records. The internet protocol address was masked. But 3 weeks ago, they found a distinct digital fingerprint, linking the routing logic to a specific terminal login. They pulled the badge photo. He gestured back toward the glass doors. And tonight, my future son-in-law drags you across a dance floor and introduces the person I have been hunting for as the family failure. He let out a dry, brief sound. It was an acknowledgement of the absurd. You should have charged me a consulting fee, Beatrice. I do not write code for recognition, I replied. The system was broken. I just realigned the flow. That is exactly why we are standing out here, he said. His tone shifted from reflective to strictly business. I am a man who respects realignment. Right now, I have a system that feels misaligned. He turned his back to the golf course and faced the ballroom. Through the glass, we could see Preston. My brother had recovered his composure. He was laughing, pouring champagne for my parents, commanding the attention of a small circle of investors. He looked exactly like the man he was pretending to be. Harper is my only daughter, Harrison said. His voice lost its corporate polish, revealing a layer of protective steel. She runs my finance division. She loves your brother. I do not interfere with her personal choices, but I am currently finalizing the acquisition of Preston's startup, Aegis HealthTech. It is a 9-figure buyout. The ink is supposed to dry by the end of the month. I nodded slowly, understanding the shape of the conversation. You are conducting due diligence. My teams have conducted due diligence, Harrison corrected. They looked at the spreadsheets Preston provided. They looked at the user acquisition charts. On paper, his telehealth platform is a rocket ship. The client engagement numbers are flawless. The retention rates are perfect. He stepped closer to me, lowering his voice. But you and I both know that real systems have friction. Hardware degrades, users churn, packets drop. Perfection is usually a symptom of a manipulated data set. His metrics are too clean. They look synthetic. I looked through the glass at Preston. He was tapping his temple, gesturing broadly, selling a vision to a captive audience. My parents watched him with unguarded adoration. This was the son they had bankrolled. This was the name they wanted to carry their legacy. I need someone who can see the invisible threads, Harrison said. My internal auditors are looking at the surface paint. I need someone to check the foundation. I want you to run a shadow audit on Aegis HealthTech, quietly, independent of my formal teams. You get backdoor access to the raw data sets. You tell me if the asset is hollow before my daughter ties her reputation and my capital to it. The request hung in the cold air between us. Auditing my brother was not a standard contract. It was a declaration of familial war. If I went into those servers and found rot, there would be no turning back. Richard and Caroline would view it as an act of profound betrayal. They would frame it as jealousy. They would defend Preston just as they had defended him every time he borrowed my homework, took credit for my ideas, or shoved me out of the frame in family photos. They were so desperate to belong in this room, so eager to trade my dignity for a seat at the billionaire's table. I did not want revenge. Revenge is a chaotic emotion, and emotions cloud data. But I wanted the truth. I believed in the unshakable reality of numbers. A flawed structure will eventually collapse. And when Aegis HealthTech fell, it would crush anyone standing underneath it, including Harper. I need root access to his server logs, I said, keeping my voice devoid of hesitation. Not the curated reports, the raw, unfiltered packet data. And I need it by morning. Harrison gave a single, decisive nod. A link will be in your secure inbox before you wake up. I did not return to the reception. I left the estate without saying goodbye to my parents, without watching Preston cut the cake, and without drinking another drop of champagne. The valet brought my modest sedan around to the front portico. I tipped him, shifted into gear, and drove north toward downtown Nashville. The highway stretched out ahead of me, empty and quiet. My mind was already mapping the digital pathways I would need to navigate. Breaking into a proprietary healthcare network would require surgical precision. Preston might be a fraud, but he had the venture capital to hire competent security developers. I knew the perimeter walls of Aegis HealthTech would be thick. As the city skyline came into view, a cold anticipation settled in my chest. The ticking clock to the merger had officially started. I just had to find the cracks in the armor before the legal teams finalized the paperwork. My apartment in downtown Nashville sat 30 stories above the Cumberland River. The space was a study in subtraction. Bare concrete floors exposed steel ductwork and a single ergonomic chair facing a custom-built processing rig. I did not keep framed family photographs or decorative clutter. My life existed within the blue glow of 3 curved monitors. Outside, the streetlights reflected off the dark water, offering the only movement in the quiet room. I set my keys on the kitchen island, bypassed the bedroom entirely, and sat down at the desk. The email from Harrison Caldwell was already waiting in my encrypted client portal. The subject line contained a single string of alphanumeric access codes. The authorization was live. I cracked my knuckles, pulled the mechanical keyboard forward, and initiated the handshake protocol. Bypassing the polished front end of Aegis HealthTech was simple. Preston spent millions on user interface design to impress venture capitalists, ensuring the application looked sleek on a smartphone screen. But cosmetic code is always fragile. I slipped past the outer presentation layer and navigated toward the foundational server directories. I expected to find a messy patchwork framework hastily assembled by underpaid contractors. That was Preston's usual operational standard. Instead, my extraction script slammed into a solid digital wall. The screen flashed a bright crimson warning prompt: access denied, connection terminated. I leaned back in my chair, the sudden rejection breaking my rhythm. I opened a secondary terminal window and deployed a relentless packet sniffer to analyze the perimeter defense. The firewall guarding the root directory was not a standard commercial product. It was a bespoke security matrix weaving through the incoming traffic with predatory efficiency. It identified my intrusion script, isolated the threat, and purged the connection in less than 0.4 of a second. The architecture was flawless. It lacked the bloated, redundant syntax characteristic of Silicon Valley development firms. This was a masterpiece of digital engineering. And it made zero logical sense. Preston did not possess the technical vocabulary to conceptualize a defense system this elegant. His hired developers were notorious for leaving backdoors wide open, prioritizing speed over security to meet arbitrary launch deadlines. A matrix this sophisticated required years of isolated, obsessive testing. I pulled the raw firewall code onto my center monitor, stripping away the outer encryption layer to study the load-bearing equations underneath. As I scrolled through the syntax, the rhythm of the data began to change. The way the data packets were sorted, the specific loop constraints, the minimalist logic gates dictating the routing paths. My fingers hovered motionless over the keys. A cold prickle of recognition traced the back of my neck. Every data architect possesses a unique signature. We all have a distinct method of solving structural problems that acts like a fingerprint left at a crime scene. I stared at the glowing text cascading down the screen. I knew these blind spots. I recognized the specific error handling protocols. I zoomed in on a cluster of logic gates near the bottom of the directory. The syntax matched the experimental frameworks I built in my late 20s. The structure was an exact mirror of my own mind. The memory surfaced with striking, uninvited clarity. 3 years ago, Preston and I briefly shared a co-working space in a converted warehouse in the Gulch. I was working as an independent consultant, spending my nights drafting complex proprietary routing frameworks on a silver external hard drive. That drive held 2 years of my raw, unpatented architecture. One Tuesday afternoon, my primary terminal froze. The silver drive registered a fatal partition error. I spent 10 agonizing hours trying to salvage the data, a tight panic gripping my chest, until the drive simply stopped spinning. It was dead. Preston walked into the office carrying 2 expensive coffees. He stood behind my chair, projecting the perfect image of a supportive older brother. "Hardware fails, Beatrice," he said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "Do not beat yourself up over it." He offered to take the corrupted drive to a specialized electronic waste facility across town. He framed it as a favor, saving me the trip so I could start rebuilding from scratch. I handed him the silver rectangle. I handed him 2 years of my life. Sitting in the cold glow of my monitors, the truth locked into place with devastating precision. He never took my hardware to a recycling center. He took it to a forensic recovery firm. He paid someone to crack the corrupted partition, extracted my brilliant, unpatented architecture, and used it to build the impenetrable firewall guarding Aegis HealthTech. The detached professionalism I prided myself on began to fracture. The financial fraud Harrison suspected was a corporate crime, but this was an intimate, calculated betrayal. Preston had stolen my intellect, used it to secure his initial seed funding, and then had the audacity to stand in a country club ballroom and call me a failure. He built his protective fortress out of my stolen labor. My pulse steadied, slowing into a deliberate, unyielding rhythm. The anger did not manifest as chaos. It crystallized into a sharp, focused wrath. Preston thought he had purchased an impenetrable shield, but he forgot a fundamental rule of engineering. You cannot lock the architect out of their own building. Because I wrote the original foundational logic, I knew exactly where the structural flaws were buried. I knew the specific sequence of commands required to trigger a maintenance override. I opened a fresh command prompt. My fingers flew across the mechanical switches, typing the master override sequence I designed 3 years prior. I hit the enter key. The crimson warning prompt vanished. The sophisticated, bespoke firewall, the defense matrix that had undoubtedly cost Preston millions of dollars to implement, folded without a single sound. The Aegis HealthTech root directory parted like a velvet curtain, granting me unrestricted access to the dark heart of the startup. I stared at the newly exposed folders filling my center screen. A chilling curiosity replaced the initial shock of the betrayal. Preston had gone to extraordinary criminal lengths to steal my proprietary code just to build this specific vault door. The friction was eliminated, but the true mystery remained unsolved. I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light illuminating my face in the dark apartment. What terrifying secret was my brother hiding behind my stolen shield? The root directory unfolded across my 3 monitors like an exposed nervous system. I bypassed the administrative folders containing glossy pitch decks and sanitized investor presentations. Those documents were pure fiction, crafted specifically to dazzle men like Harrison Caldwell with colorful pie charts and empty industry buzzwords. I sought the unfiltered telemetry. I navigated straight to the core user acquisition logs. According to the executive summary touted so proudly at the country club, Aegis HealthTech had successfully onboarded 50,000 new clinics across the country in the last quarter alone. That specific metric had justified the 9-figure valuation. I initiated a customized sorting script to parse the raw traffic data generated by these supposed medical clients. Millions of lines of code cascaded down the center screen, forming a digital river of timestamps, internet protocol addresses, and session durations. I leaned back into the ergonomic mesh of my chair, letting my eyes unfocus slightly, allowing my brain to catch the rhythm of the information. Organic digital traffic possesses a distinct, chaotic texture. Real doctors log into patient portals at irregular intervals. They pause to review complex medical charts. They type the wrong passwords. They drop off unexpectedly when a clinic wireless network stutters. Human growth is inherently messy and erratic. The traffic flowing through my brother's servers lacked humanity entirely. I isolated a specific cluster of accounts originating from the Midwest. I charted their activity over a 30-day window to visualize the flow. Every single clinic in that regional cluster logged into the terminal between 2 and 4 in the morning. They all initiated a secure telehealth session. They all maintained the connection for exactly 4.2 seconds before logging out. I pulled another cluster from a different geographic zone. The pattern repeated perfectly. The timing was flawless. The intervals were mathematically rigid. It was a metronome ticking in the dark. Preston did not possess a revolutionary healthcare platform. He operated a synchronized bot farm. He was manufacturing a mirage of exponential growth, using ghost servers to talk to his own system in an empty digital room. Manufacturing daily active users to inflate a corporate buyout constituted a severe civil offense. But as I scrutinized the data packets generated during those 4-second sessions, the architecture of the crime shifted into a far more sinister category. Simple ping requests, designed to boost traffic metrics, carry a very light data footprint. They merely knock on the server door and run away. These sessions were incredibly heavy. They carried dense encrypted payloads. I bypassed the secondary encryption key and unpacked a sample payload from a ghost clinic supposedly located in rural Ohio. The screen populated with structured medical forms. These were not blank diagnostic templates used for testing purposes. The fields were filled with fabricated patient histories, corresponding billing codes, and real Medicare identification numbers. A cold chill settled into my chest, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from my processing rig. Preston was not just simulating network load to trick venture capitalists. The automated scripts were actively generating fraudulent patient encounters. I ran a cross-reference on the identification numbers and discovered they had been purchased in bulk from dark web data brokers. The system was submitting automated claims to the federal government for phantom telehealth appointments that never happened. The ghost clinics received micropayments trickling stolen taxpayer revenue back into the Aegis ledgers to create the illusion of legitimate cash flow. While Richard and Caroline toasted to his genius at society galas, boasting about his disruption of the medical industry, their son was quietly purchasing stolen identities. They believed he was a pioneer, saving lives through technology. The reality sitting on my screens proved he was nothing more than a digital parasite. My brother had escalated from corporate exaggeration to federal healthcare fraud. This was no longer just a scheme to secure a luxurious lifestyle and a prestigious marriage. If the authorities raided his servers, he would not face a civil lawsuit or a fine. He would face decades in a federal penitentiary. The golden child of the Penn family was orchestrating a staggering theft against the United States government. The silence of my apartment felt different now. It was no longer the peaceful sanctuary of isolation. It felt heavy, saturated with the weight of impending ruin. I had expected to find manipulated spreadsheets or inflated sales projections. I had not prepared myself to uncover a scheme that could trigger a federal indictment. The scale of the deception was breathtaking, yet the mathematics of the operation presented a glaring, undeniable contradiction. I opened a separate terminal window and mapped the computational load required to sustain this level of systemic fraud. Generating synthetic traffic, routing it through masked proxy networks, and encrypting thousands of fake Medicare claims daily requires immense processing power. Renting the server space to run millions of automated scripts across multiple regional data centers demands an astronomical amount of capital. Amazon Web Services and offshore hosting providers do not accept payment in visionary press releases or hollow equity promises. They require hard currency delivered on time. I calculated the monthly burn rate for the bot farm infrastructure. The numbers climbing on my right monitor were suffocating. The operation cost hundreds of thousands of dollars every week. I dug into the historical financial ledgers, cross-referencing those operational expenses with the initial seed funding Preston had secured 2 years prior. The venture capital had been entirely depleted by the second quarter. The legitimate revenue stream was functionally non-existent, as the platform had no real paying clients. Aegis HealthTech was entirely insolvent. I pulled the vendor payout logs, attempting to trace the flow of capital backward. The financial architecture was deliberately convoluted, designed to confuse standard auditing software. Payments were broken into smaller increments, tumbling through a labyrinth of dummy accounts to disguise the total volume of expenditure. I stared at the blinking cursor, listening to the quiet hum of my processor fan. The logic gap was impossible to ignore. If the startup was out of money, the bots should have gone dark months ago. The hosting providers would have terminated the accounts for non-payment. Yet, the traffic continued to flow without a single interruption. The server hosting bills were being paid with flawless regularity. Preston was broke. His company was a hollow shell. He could barely afford the lease on his downtown penthouse, let alone fund a multinational cybercrime syndicate. I leaned forward, the blue light of the monitors casting long shadows against the bare concrete walls of my apartment. The truth was hiding somewhere in the ledger. Someone with deep pockets and a desperate motivation was keeping the ghost servers alive. Who was secretly funneling millions of dollars in hard cash to finance my brother's federal crimes? To answer the terrifying question of who was funding my brother's federal crimes, I first needed to understand how the illicit money was moving. The financial ledgers were far too heavily obfuscated to trace through standard accounting methods. Therefore, I had to reverse engineer the transaction flow. If I could map the precise pathways the automated scripts used to transmit the fake Medicare claims, I could follow the digital exhaust backward to the source of the capital. I minimized the useless investor presentations and dragged the bot farm routing engine onto my primary screen. I began peeling back the layers of the transmission software. The exterior programming was clumsy, clearly written by cheap freelance contractors trying to meet arbitrary launch deadlines. It contained redundant loops and sloppy formatting. However, as I dug deeper into the core algorithm governing the claim distribution, the landscape shifted dramatically. The clumsy formatting vanished. The underlying architecture was pristine. It managed thousands of simultaneous data requests across multiple regional networks without a single processing bottleneck. This core engine was a masterclass in load balancing. My brother was a charismatic salesman who barely passed his introductory computer science courses at his private university. He lacked the fundamental intellect to conceptualize a framework this sophisticated. He had purchased it, or he had taken it. I ran a specialized text parsing utility to search the core directory for hidden developer notes. Contract workers often leave identifying comments buried in the margins of their work. The utility scanned millions of lines of syntax in mere seconds. A single result flagged on my right monitor. It was buried 20 folders deep, hidden within an obscure error-handling subroutine. I highlighted the text line. It read, BP Protocol 0. My hands stopped hovering over the keyboard. They dropped to my lap, resting heavy and still against the fabric of my dark trousers. A sharp, icy sensation bloomed in the center of my chest, radiating outward until my fingertips went numb. The ambient noise of the city traffic drifting through my high-rise windows seemed to mute. BP Protocol 0 was not a random string of characters. It was a very specific naming convention. It was my naming convention. During my early 20s, while Preston was attending lavish fraternity galas and burning through our parents' wealth, I was living in a cramped studio apartment near the university campus. I spent 3 relentless years developing an experimental data routing concept. It was designed to optimize medical record transfers for underfunded rural clinics. I called the thesis project Protocol Zero. It was the lifeblood of my early career, stored safely on a silver external drive. That same drive experienced a critical failure 3 years ago. Preston had offered to take it to a specialized recovery technician. He framed it as a generous favor. 2 weeks later, he told me the platters were irreparably scored and the data was lost forever. He handed me back an empty metal casing and a sympathetic smile. I pushed my ergonomic chair back, unlocked my personal encrypted archive, and retrieved the original developmental backups of Protocol Zero. I placed my early blueprints side by side with the Aegis HealthTech routing engine. I did not just compare the broad strokes. I initiated a forensic line-by-line analysis. The results populated instantly. The syntax was a perfect mirror. The unique logic gates I had designed to bypass legacy server bottlenecks were duplicated without a single alteration. Even the structural flaws, the slight inefficiencies I had written when I was 24 years old and still learning my craft, were copied verbatim. The theft was profound and absolute. Preston had not just stolen a firewall concept to protect his network. He had stolen the entire engine of my intellect. He harvested my thousands of hours of unseen labor, polished the exterior, and presented it to the venture capital world as his own revolutionary breakthrough. The nature of the conflict fundamentally transformed in that silent room. Uncovering the Medicare billing scheme felt like a clinical exercise in corporate auditing. It was a severe crime against the federal government, but it lacked a personal sting. Staring at my own code powering his fraudulent empire felt like a physical violation. He had pilfered my mind. He built his golden boy pedestal out of my stolen aspirations. He used my genius to secure luxury penthouses, bespoke tailoring, and a coveted engagement to a billionaire heiress. While Richard and Caroline toasted his fictitious genius at society galas, boasting to their affluent friends about his unparalleled disruption of the medical industry, their son was quietly profiting off my sweat. They had proudly co-signed loans to furnish his pristine office space, believing they were supporting a pioneer. All the while, I was working night shifts to pay for my own groceries, believing my greatest achievement had been destroyed by a simple hardware malfunction. The psychological cruelty of his deception was staggering. He watched me struggle, knowing he held the key to my success, locked inside his own bank accounts. And then, standing in the opulent ballroom of the Belmead Country Club, he had the breathtaking audacity to introduce me to his future father-in-law as the family failure. He mocked the very foundation he was standing on. My parents had clapped and laughed, oblivious to the fact that their celebrated son was nothing more than a parasite wearing a tailored suit. I did not weep. I did not throw my coffee mug against the bare concrete wall. Emotion is a useless metric. It solves nothing and leaves a messy trail. Instead, my focus sharpened into a sterile, unforgiving clarity. I initiated a secure extraction sequence. I began meticulously mapping the stolen logic loops, cross-referencing every duplicated command with my time-stamped original archives. I documented the exact progression of the intellectual property theft. I highlighted the matching timestamps, the duplicated error codes, and the identical routing pathways. I drafted an airtight, indisputable dossier. This single file possessed the power to invalidate his entire corporate valuation. It would prove to Harrison Caldwell that he was attempting to purchase stolen goods. It would erase my brother's name from the technology sector permanently. I saved the completed forensic comparison into the growing execution file. The weapon was forged. But the blueprint of my stolen protocol provided one final crucial piece of telemetry. Because I understood the intimate architecture of the routing engine, I knew exactly how it masked outgoing financial transmissions. I opened a terminal window and applied my own decryption key to the bot farm payment gateways. The artificial fog lifted immediately. The hidden pathway illuminated on my screen, revealing a steady stream of wire transfers flowing out of the corporate ledgers. The money, keeping the ghost servers alive, bounced through a commercial clearinghouse in Delaware before landing in a regional shell company. The receiving entity was registered to a postal box in Memphis. I leaned forward, my eyes tracking the routing numbers as they decoded in real time. The question of who was secretly funding the fraud was finally within reach, and the digital trail promised to pull the rest of my family into the wreckage. The digital breadcrumbs left a very clear trail. Using my own decryption key, I followed the outbound wire transfers from the Aegis HealthTech ledgers. The money keeping the ghost servers operational bounced through a corporate clearinghouse in Delaware. From there, it tumbled down into a regional shell entity, registered to a commercial postal box in Memphis. The financial structure was bleeding cash at an astonishing velocity. Every Friday afternoon, a six-figure sum drained from the corporate accounts to pay the offshore hosting providers. The venture funding had evaporated long ago, yet this Memphis entity pumped fresh liquidity into the system with mechanical precision. I needed to see the genesis of that liquidity. I ran a reverse trace on the Memphis routing numbers, slipping past the standard banking firewalls to locate the originating ledger. I expected to uncover a shady angel investor, or perhaps an unregulated offshore loan. Instead, the screen populated with familiar domestic banking prefixes. The originating account belonged to a regional commercial bank based right here in Tennessee. I initiated a targeted query into the state property registry, matching the banking data against public loan filings. A digital document materialized on my center monitor. It was a formal deed of trust filed just 8 months prior. I scanned the borrower details. The name typed at the top of the loan agreement was Beatrice Penn. My father spent his entire career projecting the image of a shrewd, invulnerable real estate mogul. He held court at the Belmead Country Club, dispensing unsolicited financial advice while swirling expensive scotch. He built an entire identity around fiscal conservatism and generational wealth. He loved to lecture me during holiday dinners about the virtues of hard work and self-reliance, frequently citing my modest apartment as proof that I lacked his entrepreneurial spirit. Yet the document sitting on my screen proved the patriarch had taken out a high-risk, variable-rate commercial mortgage. A commercial loan of this scale required substantial collateral. I scrolled down to the schedule of assets attached to the deed. Richard did not mortgage his pristine Brentwood estate. He did not leverage his private stock portfolios. He used a defunct family trust. My grandfather established that specific trust decades ago. He was a quiet, practical man who distrusted the opulent lifestyle Richard chased. The trust was intended to serve as an educational safety net for the grandchildren. Upon his passing, the legal structure dictated that any disbursement or leveraging of the assets required unanimous, notarized consent from all named beneficiaries. My name was listed as a primary beneficiary. I pulled up the signature page of the digital filing. There, resting near the bottom margin, in perfect flowing cursive, was my name. I stared at the looping letters. My hands gripped the armrests of my chair, the plastic biting into my palms. I never signed that document. I had not seen a single piece of paperwork regarding the grandfather trust since I was 19 years old. The ink on the page was a forgery. The parameters of the crime shifted with terrifying magnitude. My father had not just co-signed a minor business loan to help his struggling son. He committed felony identity fraud. He stole my name to illegally mortgage a protected trust. He took that stolen liquidity, funneled it through a dummy corporation in Memphis, and used it to finance Preston's federal Medicare scam. Richard and Caroline were not naive victims blinded by their love for a charismatic child. They were active, willing conspirators. They knew Preston was broke. They knew his telehealth startup was a hollow sham. Rather than force their golden boy to face reality, they chose to bankrupt themselves and forge my signature to keep his illusion afloat. They risked federal prison time to preserve their societal optics. The country club galas, the designer gowns, the smug introductions at high society weddings, all of it was funded by stolen money and identity theft. The betrayal ran deeper than a stolen coding prototype. It was a systemic, familial rot. They viewed me as an invisible asset, a disposable resource to be harvested whenever Preston required a fresh pedestal. They believed they could steal my intellect and my legal identity without consequence. My entire life, they told me I was the disappointment. They framed my independence as a character flaw. In reality, my independence was the only thing keeping me out of their criminal syndicate. The shock morphed into a cold, clinical focus. I compiled the forged deed of trust, the Memphis routing numbers, and the Delaware transaction logs into the encrypted dossier. The evidence was airtight. I had the stolen intellectual property, the fake Medicare billing records, and the fraudulent mortgage. Harrison Caldwell asked for a shadow audit. I was preparing to hand him an execution warrant for the entire Penn family hierarchy. The silence of my apartment felt heavy, charged with the static electricity of an impending storm. The city below my window was beginning to stir, early morning traffic painting streaks of red and white along the wet pavement. I saved the final file path and locked the directory. A sudden vibration shattered the quiet hum of my processing rig. My phone illuminated on the desk, casting a harsh white glare across the dark wood. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I watched the screen glow, calculating the tactical purpose of the call. Caroline never contacted me before noon unless she required an audience for a manufactured crisis. I picked up the device and accepted the connection. Beatrice, Caroline said. Her voice carried that practiced, melodic pitch she reserved for issuing demands masked as polite requests. We are having a family dinner tonight at 8. Preston is feeling anxious about his upcoming merger, and your father wants everyone together. Do not be late. The line went dead before I could reply. I set the phone down. Preston was paranoid. His encounter with Harrison Caldwell on the terrace had planted a seed of doubt in his mind. He needed to read my face. He needed to know exactly what the billionaire had said to the family failure. The digital war I had waged all night was about to cross over into physical reality. The trap was set, and my parents had just invited me to walk right into the center of it. The drive south into Brentwood felt like crossing an invisible border. The dense concrete and neon hum of downtown Nashville gave way to sprawling acreage, wrought iron gates, and long driveways paved with crushed river stone. This enclave was engineered to project an aura of effortless prosperity. I parked my modest sedan between my father's imported luxury sport utility vehicle and Preston's sleek European coupe. Both machines were monuments to their fabricated success, purchased with capital stolen from a forged family trust and sustained by federal fraud. I walked up the brick pathway. The heavy oak front door swung open before I could reach the brass knocker. Caroline stood in the entryway wearing a pale silk blouse and a strained, fragile smile. The foyer smelled of expensive lavender diffusers and roasted lamb. My mother kissed the air near my cheek, a hollow gesture she perfected for society luncheons. She guided me toward the formal dining room, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm against the polished hardwood floor. The staging was impeccable, yet the atmosphere inside the house felt remarkably fragile. The mahogany dining table was set with fine china and crystal glassware. Richard sat at the head of the table. The harsh light from the chandelier exposed a gray, sickly undertone to his skin. He looked like a man carrying a crushing physical weight. Preston sat to his right, swirling a glass of red wine. His posture lacked the relaxed, arrogant lean he usually adopted. His shoulders were tight, his eyes darting toward the entryway the moment I stepped into the room. I took my assigned seat across from my brother. I unfolded the linen napkin and placed it on my lap. The dinner commenced with a synchronized mechanical performance. Caroline fluttered around the sideboard serving portions of lamb and roasted root vegetables while maintaining a steady stream of trivial conversation. She discussed the country club landscaping committee and upcoming charity galas, desperate to fill the heavy silence with noise. Richard did not participate in the trivialities. He picked at his food, his jaw set in a rigid line. Midway through the main course, he set his fork down and reached into his tailored jacket pocket. He retrieved a small orange prescription bottle, tapped a pill into his palm, and swallowed it with a generous gulp of wine. "My blood pressure has been spiking all week," Richard announced, rubbing the center of his chest. The commercial real estate market is shifting. Capital is tied up in investments, and maintaining our liquidity requires precise timing right now. I watched him massage his sternum. He framed his anxiety as the burden of a savvy investor navigating a tough economy. I knew the truth. His liquidity issues had nothing to do with market shifts. He was buckling under the terror of his own felony. The Memphis shell company demanded constant feeding to keep Preston's ghost servers operational. The variable rate on the forged second mortgage was draining his accounts dry. He was sitting at the head of his opulent table, eating premium lamb, while secretly waiting for a financial guillotine to drop. "We all need to focus on crossing the finish line," Richard continued, his gaze drifting toward Preston. "The Caldwell merger will finalize soon. We just need to manage the optics until the paperwork clears." Preston nodded, though the gesture appeared rigid and forced. He took another sip of wine, his hand trembling, just enough to cause ripples in the dark liquid. He set the glass down and turned his attention directly to me. His eyes narrowed, reflecting a toxic blend of fear and condescension. He needed to reassert his dominance. He needed to confirm that the hierarchy was still intact. "So, Beatrice," Preston said, his voice carrying a sharp, biting edge, "you disappeared rather quickly last night. Harrison is a busy man. People in my circle spend years trying to get 5 minutes of his time. It was generous of him to humor you, but you should not have bothered him. What did he want to talk about?" He phrased the inquiry as a casual observation, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the mahogany table. He was hunting for data packets. He needed to read my baseline to determine if his fragile empire was compromised. "We discussed my background," I replied evenly. I sliced a small piece of lamb and brought it to my mouth. "Your background," Preston repeated. He let out a short, dismissive laugh, looking at our parents to gather his audience. What did he want? A tutorial on running server maintenance for mid-tier data centers? Caroline offered a soft, nervous chuckle, eager to smooth the rough edges of his mockery. "Now, Preston, your sister does reliable work. It pays her bills." I chewed my food, swallowed, and maintained unbroken eye contact with my brother. In the past, this was the exact moment I would either defend my career or quietly excuse myself from the table to avoid further humiliation. My silence unsettled him. By refusing to follow the established script, I forced him to sit in his own insecurity. "Harrison just wanted a second opinion," I said, keeping my tone mild and conversational. "A second opinion on what Preston pressed." His voice grew louder, the polished tech founder facade cracking to reveal the terrified fraud underneath. "You do not know anything about artificial intelligence. You do not know anything about venture scaling. What could you possibly tell a man like Harrison Caldwell?" I set my knife and fork down on the edges of my porcelain plate. The silver made a sharp, definitive clink against the fine china. I picked up my linen napkin and dabbed the corners of my mouth. I looked directly into Preston's eyes, letting the quiet stretch until the air in the dining room felt dense and suffocating. "He wanted my opinion on network integrity," I said. Specifically, he asked me to evaluate the server load required to sustain automated container orchestration for a telehealth platform. The dining room went dead silent. Preston stopped breathing. The color drained from his face at a terrifying speed, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. His eyes widened, reflecting a sudden, profound terror. Automated container orchestration was the exact technical terminology required to run a cyclical bot farm. It was the precise phrase hidden in the back end of his fraudulent user acquisition logs. He knew the phrase. He knew exactly what it meant. And in that frozen fraction of a second, he realized that I was already inside his system. He realized I had seen the ghost servers. He realized the hollow shell of his impending billionaire buyout was sitting squarely in the palm of my hand. Richard frowned, oblivious to the technical terminology, but highly attuned to the sudden, drastic shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. "What does that mean?" my father asked, looking between the two of us. "What is she talking about?" Preston could not answer him. He could not even blink. He just stared at me, his jaw slack, a single bead of sweat tracking down the side of his temple. "It is just shop talk, Dad," I said, pushing my heavy wooden chair back from the table. "Nothing you need to worry your blood pressure over." I placed my napkin on the table and stood up. Caroline stared at me, sensing the danger but lacking the vocabulary to understand the threat. "Thank you for the dinner," I said, maintaining polite, unwavering eye contact with my paralyzed brother. The lamb was exceptional. I turned and walked out of the formal dining room. I did not look back. I walked down the arched hallway, opened the heavy oak door, and stepped out into the cool Tennessee night. The psychological trap had been set and triggered with flawless precision. I started my car and drove away from the gated enclave, leaving Preston trapped at a table with his suffocating father and his performative mother. He knew the truth was out. He knew I held the leverage. As my tires hit the dark asphalt of the highway, a cold anticipation settled over me. A cornered animal never surrenders quietly. The golden boy was drowning, and I knew it was only a matter of hours before he attempted a desperate, blind retaliation in the dark. The drive from Brentwood back to the urban core of Nashville afforded me 30 quiet minutes to process the fractured dynamics of my parents' dining room. By the time I unlocked the door to my high-rise apartment, the adrenaline had settled into a cool, functional rhythm. I did not turn on the overhead lights. The glow from the street lamps below and the stark blue illumination of my 3 computer monitors provided all the visibility I required. The digital clock on the corner of my center screen ticked forward. It read 11:45. I poured a glass of cold water and stood by the window, watching the distant headlights trace red and white lines along the interstate. My brother was a creature of predictable habits. He possessed a fragile ego constructed entirely from unearned praise and artificial milestones. The trap I set at the dinner table had stripped away his primary defense mechanism. He could no longer rely on his charismatic smile or our parents' protective shielding to deflect the truth. I knew he would not wait for the morning to confront the threat. A cornered predator always moves under the cover of dark. Exactly 15 minutes later, a heavy impact shuddered through my front door. It was not a polite knock or a formal announcement. It was a frantic, irregular pounding that vibrated against the brass hinges and echoed down the silent concrete hallway of my floor. The digital clock rolled to midnight. The physical confrontation had arrived. I set my glass on the kitchen island and walked to the entryway. I did not rush. Panic dictates speed, and I was the one holding the leverage. I pressed my eye against the distorted glass lens of the peephole. The figure standing in the corridor bore very little resemblance to the polished tech executive who had charmed billionaires at the Belmead Country Club. Preston was unraveling in real time. His expensive suit jacket was gone. His crisp dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the fabric wrinkled and clinging to his chest. His carefully styled hair hung loose over his forehead. He dragged a trembling hand across his face, smearing a sheen of sweat. He raised a clenched fist to strike the wood again. I reached out, disengaged the deadbolt, but left the heavy brass security chain secured in its track. I pulled the door open just a few inches, using my body and the metallic chain as a physical barrier. The stale scent of expensive red wine and raw fear washed through the narrow gap. "Open the door," Beatrice Preston demanded. His voice lacked the smooth, authoritative baritone he utilized during venture capital pitches. It sounded thin, reedy, and strained by suppressed hysteria. "We need to talk right now." "We are talking," I replied. My tone remained flat, offering zero emotional traction for him to grip. "State your business." He let out a short, jagged laugh, his eyes darting up and down the empty hallway, paranoid that a neighbor might overhear his unraveling. "What game are you playing?" he hissed, leaning his weight against the doorframe. "You show up at my wedding, you whisper in Harrison Caldwell's ear, and then you sit at my dinner table throwing around network terminology like some kind of threat? What did you say to him?" I kept my hands resting loosely at my sides and maintained my silence. In any interrogation, silence is the heaviest weapon. When faced with a void, a desperate opponent will always rush to fill the empty space. In their rush, they exposed their baseline methodology. Preston could not handle the quiet. His eyes searched my face for a tell, a flinch, or any sign of the submissive sister he had spent a lifetime conditioning. He found a stone wall. His frustration boiled over into his default strategy. He attempted to use intimidation disguised as condescension. "You think you are so clever," he sneered, his knuckles turning white against the door jamb. "You sit in this dark little concrete box, staring at screens, and you think you understand how the real world operates? You have always been delusional. Ever since we were kids, you live in a fantasy where hard work actually matters. Optics matter, Beatrice. Relationships matter. I built an empire while you were debugging mainframes for hourly wages." He leaned closer, his breath hot against the crack in the doorway. "You are trying to sabotage the biggest deal of my life because you are jealous. You cannot stand the fact that Harper chose me. You cannot stand the fact that Dad respects me. You are a bitter, lonely spinster. And if you try to ruin this merger with whatever petty technical glitch you think you found, I will make sure you never work in the technology sector again. I have investors. I have ruthless corporate lawyers. I will bury you in litigation." I listened to his tirade, charting the emotional trajectory of his words. It was classic psychological warfare. Attack the credibility, project his own insecurity onto the target, and threaten their livelihood. 5 years ago, those threats might have found a vulnerability. They might have made me question my own sanity. Tonight, they sounded like a predictable algorithm executing a faulty command. "Are you finished?" I asked. He blinked, thrown off balance by my total lack of defense. He opened his mouth to launch another threat, but his bravado suddenly shattered. The aggressive posture dissolved, replaced by a pathetic, crumbling submission. He pivoted to the last resort of a guilty man. He played the victim. "Beatrice, please," he whispered. His voice cracked, tears welling in his eyes in a manipulative display of remorse. "You do not understand the pressure. You do not know what it is like to have Dad breathing down your neck expecting perfection. The investors wanted metrics. The board wanted growth. The developers made a mistake in the routing code. It is just a glitch. We just need to hide it until the Caldwell buyout clears. Once the capital comes in, I can hire real developers to fix the platform. We are family. You have to help me hide this glitch." He reached his fingers through the gap, grasping at the empty air near my shoulder. "It is not a glitch, Preston," I stated, slicing through his manufactured victimhood. "You do not have 50,000 new enterprise clients. You are running a cyclical bot farm. You are masking synthetic traffic to inflate your daily active user count, and you are using those bots to generate fake Medicare claims." His jaw locked. The muscles in his neck strained against his skin. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp escaped his throat. "And synthetic traffic costs capital," I continued, my voice dropping to a low, unforgiving register. "You ran out of seed funding months ago, so every Friday you wire the offshore hosting fees through a clearinghouse in Delaware." I leaned closer to the gap in the door, locking my gaze onto his terrified eyes. "The receiving entity is a shell company in Memphis." I paused, letting the silence stretch for one agonizing second. "Funded by the liquidity from our father's forged commercial mortgage." The words struck him with the force of physical blows. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His hand fell away from the doorframe. The bluster, the arrogance, and the polished tech founder persona evaporated into the stagnant air of the hallway. He was no longer the apex predator of the Penn family. He was a cornered thief, staring at the person who held the ledger. He stepped back, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. He looked at the floor, shaking his head in slow, erratic movements. "And you did not build it," I added, driving the final nail into the architecture of his lies. "BP Protocol 0. You stole my external hard drive. You stole my logic loops. You built your pedestal out of my labor. You have no lawyers. You have no empire. You have nothing." Preston opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. He was standing over a digital abyss, and he realized I possessed the map to every single secret he harbored. I reached forward, unhooked the brass chain, and grabbed the edge of the heavy door. I pulled the wood shut. The deadbolt clicked into place with a sharp metallic finality. I did not walk away. I leaned forward and pressed my eye against the peephole lens. I watched my brother standing alone in the corridor. For a long, agonizing minute, his head hung low, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. The reality of his impending ruin weighed down on him, pressing him toward the carpet. But then the posture of defeat shifted. His head snapped up, his jaw clenched, the muscles working furiously under his skin. The despair evaporated, replaced by a dark, cornered malice. He realized begging would not work. He realized I could not be manipulated or threatened into compliance. Preston reached into his trousers and pulled out his smartphone. His thumbs moved rapidly across the illuminated glass, his face twisted in a mask of pure, vindictive focus. He was not looking for a solution. He was not drafting a surrender or a confession to his heiress fiancée. He was formulating a lie. He was preparing to initiate a preemptive strike, hoping to destroy my credibility before the morning sun rose over the Nashville skyline. I stepped away from the peephole and walked back toward my processing rig. The dark malice twisting my brother's features in the hallway confirmed what I already knew. The rules of engagement had fundamentally shifted. Preston was not going to wait for the morning to defend his fraudulent empire. A cornered animal strikes first, and his primary weapon had always been his ability to control the narrative. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and checked the digital clock. It read 12:14 in the morning. The physical confrontation at my door had lasted less than 15 minutes, but the parameters of the conflict were accelerating rapidly. I woke my 3 curved monitors. Before Preston even reached the elevator bank of my building, I opened a secure communication channel linked to the shadow audit protocol Harrison Caldwell had established. I did not need to guess what Preston was typing on his smartphone. I needed to intercept it. I deployed a silent automated threat monitoring system designed to track all outgoing external communications from the Aegis HealthTech corporate domain. I targeted any correspondence directed toward the Caldwell logistics infrastructure. I waited in the quiet glow of my apartment, my fingers resting lightly on the keyboard edge. Within 20 minutes, the monitor chimed. A high-priority email cleared the Aegis servers. The subject line was flagged urgent. It read, "Confidential personnel warning regarding Beatrice Penn." The sender was Preston. The recipient was the Chief of Human Resources at Caldwell Logistics, with a blind carbon copy directed straight to Harrison Caldwell's executive assistant. I initiated a packet interception, decrypted the body text, and displayed the message across my center screen. I read the text slowly, mapping the architecture of his desperation. The email was a masterpiece of corporate character assassination. Preston did not sound angry, vindictive, or panicked. He adopted the tone of a burdened, compassionate older brother forced to make a difficult professional decision for the safety of an impending merger. He claimed that I was a disgruntled former contractor who had recently suffered a severe mental health crisis following a string of career failures. He stated that I harbored a delusional fixation on his success and was known to fabricate malicious technical data to damage the reputations of my family members. He strongly advised the Caldwell executive team to disregard any communication or unsolicited audits I might submit. He cited a fictitious history of erratic behavior and vindictive sabotage, painting me as an unstable threat. He was attempting to frame me as a liability before I could frame him as a criminal. He understood that in the high-stakes environment of a 9-figure corporate acquisition, legal teams default to extreme caution. If human resources flagged me as a potential lawsuit risk or a compromised source, Harrison might be forced by his own board of directors to dismiss my findings entirely to protect their due diligence protocols. The strategy was ruthless, calculating, and potentially devastating. However, his attack relied on one critical, fatal assumption. He assumed I was playing the same social game he was. He assumed I would react to the smear campaign by panicking, calling Harrison to defend myself, or initiating a messy, emotional public dispute to clear my name. I did none of those things. In the realm of data auditing, emotional reactions are liabilities. When someone attacks your credibility with a lie, aggressively defending yourself often inadvertently validates their premise. You look defensive. You look unstable. You look exactly like the person they described in their smear campaign. Instead of fighting his narrative, I decided to weaponize it against him. The offshore hosting records the Medicare billing anomalies, and the Memphis shell company routing numbers provided an undeniable trail of fraud. But Preston could still deploy a defense of plausible deniability. He could blame a rogue chief financial officer. He could claim a rogue developer installed the bot farm without his knowledge. He had insulated himself from the daily operational code, acting only as the visionary figurehead. To pin the entire criminal structure to him personally, I needed more than circumstantial financial trails. I needed an action executed directly from his master administrator account. I needed his irrevocable digital fingerprint stamped directly on the crime scene. To secure that fingerprint, I had to make him drop his guard. I had to give him a victory. I had to let him believe his smear campaign had worked flawlessly and that my shadow audit had been reduced to a desperate, petty grievance. I opened the formal due diligence portal Harrison had provided. This portal was visible to the Aegis executive team, including Preston. It was the official channel for reporting compliance issues during the merger review. I bypassed the critical server logs, ignoring the bot farm and the Medicare fraud entirely. I navigated to the most trivial, mundane section of the corporate ledger. I accessed the executive expense accounts. Preston treated his corporate credit card like a personal slush fund. It was an open secret in his social orbit, but venture capitalists rarely scrutinize dinner receipts when a company projects exponential revenue growth. I pulled his transaction history for the past 6 months and initiated a targeted filter searching for blatant policy violations. I found exactly what I needed within 3 minutes. I isolated a series of exorbitant charges originating from a luxury resort in the Maldives. The billing occurred during a week Preston claimed to be attending a vital supply chain conference in Berlin. The charges included private yacht charters, premium champagne service, and an outrageously expensive couples spa package. In the context of a 9-figure corporate merger involving federal wire fraud and stolen intellectual property, these charges were a microscopic rounding error. But to a narcissistic founder obsessed with his public image, it was a profound embarrassment. It was the kind of petty theft that ruins the polished optics he relied upon to charm his investors and his billionaire future father-in-law. I drafted a formal compliance anomaly report within the due diligence portal. I attached the Maldives receipts, highlighted the geographical date discrepancies, and flagged the transactions as unauthorized personal luxury expenses requiring immediate executive review. I did not mention the bot farm. I did not mention the stolen code or the forged family trust. I framed the entire inquiry around a few $1,000s in stolen champagne. I clicked submit. The alert pinged across the Aegis network, landing directly in Preston's administrative inbox. This was the red herring. The trap was set. I sat back in my chair and visualized the sequence of events about to unfold in my brother's mind. He would see the anomaly report. He would read the accusation regarding the Maldives trip. The initial shock of the alert would quickly dissolve into arrogant relief. He would assume that this petty expense violation was the absolute limit of my auditing capabilities. He would conclude that my grand threats at his apartment door were a complete bluff and that I lacked the technical skill to find the heavily encrypted ghost servers. Most importantly, he would believe that his preemptive smear campaign had successfully discredited me, forcing me to grasp at insignificant straws to validate my role. He would laugh off the Maldives report as the desperate act of a jealous, mentally unstable sister trying to cause a minor inconvenience. But Preston's ego would not allow even a minor blemish on his record. He would want the anomaly erased before the Caldwell legal team reviewed the finalized expense ledgers in the morning. He would want to bury the receipts to maintain the illusion of absolute perfection. To bury those receipts, he could not use a standard developer account. The due diligence portal required top-tier authorization to modify flagged compliance files. He would have to log in using his master admin credentials. The God Mode token that granted unrestricted access to the entire Aegis infrastructure. When a user logs in with a master token, the internal firewall protocols briefly lower their shields to allow the encrypted handshake. It creates a microsecond window of vulnerability in the core server architecture, a window that a skilled data architect can exploit. I opened a secondary terminal, bypassing the formal portal, and parked my digital presence right outside the Aegis master firewall. I typed a string of executable code, building a silent packet sniffer designed to piggyback on the next master admin login. I did not need to break the door down. I just needed Preston to open it from the inside. I watched the digital clock on my screen. 1:47 in the morning. The silence in the apartment felt different now. It was the tense, coiled silence of a predator waiting in the brush. If Preston ignored the expense report, the trap would fail. I would have to find another way to prove his direct culpability, and the ticking clock to the morning merger meeting would run out. I stared at the blinking cursor, waiting to see if my brother's vanity would finally eclipse his caution. The digital clock on my center monitor shifted to 1:52 in the morning. The glow from the screens cast sharp angles across the bare concrete walls of my apartment. I sat perfectly still in the ergonomic chair, my hands resting lightly on the armrests. I watched the command prompt blinking steadily in the dark terminal window. I had deployed the packet sniffer, positioning it just outside the Aegis HealthTech firewall. Now the entire operation hinged on my brother's predictability. Preston possessed an insatiable need for a spotless public image. He spent his entire life curating an aesthetic of effortless superiority. Our parents cultivated this obsession early, prioritizing country club appearances and tailored clothing over actual substance. He was taught that optics were the only currency that mattered. He could not tolerate a blemish, not even a minor accounting discrepancy, especially with a 9-figure buyout looming at dawn. At 2:14 in the morning, the terminal screen flickered. A new connection request hit the Aegis external node. I leaned forward, my pulse maintaining a steady, even rhythm. The Internet protocol address originated from a luxury loft in downtown Nashville. It was Preston's residence. The authorization protocol initiated requesting access to the executive financial ledgers within the due diligence portal. A prompt appeared on my screen, confirming the encrypted handshake. Master admin token verified. He took the bait. He was logging in to delete his petty theft from the Maldives trip. He believed he was executing a simple cover-up, entirely unaware that he was handing me the keys to his fraudulent empire. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, executing the piggyback script. The code slipped through the momentarily lowered firewall, attaching itself invisibly to his encrypted session. I was inside the core servers, riding the wake of his administrative token. The download progress bar appeared on my monitor. I needed 3 minutes to extract the foundational logs linking his master account to the bot farm authorization. 3 minutes of uninterrupted access before the firewall reset. The progress bar filled with agonizing slowness. 7%, 12%, 18%. I opened a secondary monitoring window to track Preston's activity. He was currently navigating the executive ledgers, locating the flagged Maldives receipts. He was modifying the timestamps and attempting to delete the unauthorized luxury expenses from the corporate record. He thought he was covering his tracks, cleaning the slate before the Caldwell legal team arrived in the morning. He had no idea my extraction script was silently pulling the heavily encrypted logs of the ghost servers directly from the root directory beneath him. 34%. I needed to move faster. Once Preston finished modifying the expense files, he would log out, terminating the master session and slamming the firewall shut, trapping my extraction script inside the network. While the primary download crawled forward, I utilized the temporary administrative access to execute a secondary maneuver. When a user logs into a highly secured network with a master token and alters a financial ledger, the system architecture requires an automatic synchronization check. To ensure the integrity of the corporate record, the master token must verify its credentials against the active server state. This process is designed to prevent unauthorized tampering. Preston was rushing. He was panicked and sloppy, prioritizing speed over protocol to scrub the receipts as fast as possible. He bypassed the standard security checkpoints to force the deletion. In doing so, his irrevocable digital signature was permanently stamped onto the active session logs. Those active session logs included the corrupted directory housing the bot farm traffic. He inadvertently left a glowing, undeniable fingerprint on the exact sector of the network where the fake Medicare billing occurred. He could no longer claim ignorance. He could no longer blame a rogue developer or a careless financial officer. The metadata proved that the chief executive officer knew the ghost servers were active and chose to bypass them to hide a petty theft. 68%. Preston initiated the deletion command for the Maldives receipts. The Aegis server registered the change. He was preparing to log out. 89%. The extraction script pulled the final block of encrypted data linking the Memphis shell company to the active bot farm. 97%. The terminal window displayed a warning prompt. Master session termination initiated by user. The firewall was preparing to close. 100%. Extraction complete. I terminated the piggyback script a fraction of a second before the Aegis network slammed the security gates shut. The connection severed. I was out. I sat back in my chair and exhaled a slow, controlled breath. I had the master admin logs. I had the digital signature linking Preston directly to the bot farm authorization. The red herring had paid off flawlessly. My brother had swallowed the bait, believing he was outsmarting a jealous sibling, while actively providing the exact evidence I needed to secure his federal indictment. I compiled the extracted data into a single directory. I placed the synchronized session logs side by side with the fake Medicare billing records. The connection was undeniable. The metadata confirmed his direct, intentional knowledge of the fraudulent architecture. He verified the ghost servers himself mere minutes ago. The culpability was absolute. I spent the next hour organizing the raw files, ensuring the narrative of the fraud was clear and irrefutable. I wanted the Caldwell legal team to understand the depth of the deception without requiring a technical translation. I prepared the visual evidence, formatting the stolen logic loops, the forged family trust document, and the master token signature into a streamlined presentation. At 3:45 in the morning, I locked the completed execution package into an encrypted folder on my secure tablet. The digital war was over. I had won. But securing the evidence was only half the battle. Presenting it required navigating the final, desperate resistance of my family. I stood up from the desk and walked into my bedroom. I opened the closet and bypassed the casual clothing I usually wore for late-night coding sessions. I pulled out a sharp, tailored charcoal suit. It was understated, designed to fit perfectly, offering no unnecessary flourishes. It was the armor of a professional auditor preparing to dismantle an empire. I took a shower, the scalding water washing away the static tension of the night. I tied my hair back into a severe knot, slid my feet into polished black heels, and returned to the living room. I picked up the encrypted tablet, its weight solid and reassuring in my hand. The city outside my window was beginning to lighten the bruised purple of the pre-dawn sky, yielding to the pale gray of early morning. The Caldwell acquisition meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock at the corporate headquarters. I gathered my keys and walked out of my apartment, locking the door behind me. I rode the elevator down to the ground floor, my mind already mapping the sequence of the upcoming boardroom presentation. The marble floors of the lobby reflected the pale morning light filtering through the large glass entrance doors. The building was quiet, the usual morning foot traffic yet to begin. I adjusted my grip on the tablet and walked toward the exit. As I approached the final pillar near the glass doors, the shadows shifted. A figure detached from the alcove near the security desk, stepping directly into my path. The silhouette blocked the morning light, forcing me to stop. I tightened my grip on the tablet. The final merger meeting was hours away, but the physical confrontation had arrived early. My father stood between me and the exit, his posture rigid and commanding. The patriarch had arrived to defend his crumbling kingdom. Standing in the quiet marble lobby, my fingers gripping the cold metal edge of the encrypted tablet, I felt the immense, terrifying weight of the digital weapon I carried. Before I could step forward to confront the shadow blocking the glass exit doors, my mind retraced the precise, methodical hours I had just spent in the dark of my apartment forging the execution package. An effective auditor does not merely dump raw data onto a boardroom table. Unstructured information leaves room for interpretation, and interpretation breeds plausible deniability. To dismantle an empire, you must construct a narrative of undeniable ruin. Following the successful extraction of Preston's metadata, I had locked the doors to my apartment and initiated a total communications blackout. The glow of the 3 curved monitors provided the only illumination as I began organizing the raw telemetry into a streamlined, irrefutable presentation. I divided the execution package into 4 distinct pillars. Each pillar was designed to sever a specific lifeline keeping Aegis HealthTech afloat. The first pillar was the intellectual property theft. I created a visual flowchart placing the startup's core algorithmic engine directly beside my own archived blueprints from 3 years ago. I highlighted the stolen logic loops in stark, high-contrast yellow. The focal point of the slide was the hidden developer comment tag reading BP Protocol 0. This section was engineered to obliterate the corporate valuation instantly. Harrison Caldwell was a titan of logistics and efficiency. He would look at the mirrored syntax and instantly recognize that the foundational asset of the 9-figure buyout was stolen property. The golden boy of Nashville tech was a plagiarist who built a fortress using bricks he pilfered from his sister. The second pillar was the venom in the bite. I imported the user acquisition logs focusing entirely on the cyclical bot farm. I did not just display the automated pings hitting the servers at 2 a.m. I cross-referenced those 4-second proxy sessions with the fabricated patient identification numbers purchased from dark web data brokers. I mapped the exact route the ghost clinics utilized to submit fake telehealth claims to the federal government. Exaggerating user engagement metrics to private investors constitutes a severe civil dispute. Stealing taxpayer funds transforms a boardroom negotiation into a federal indictment. I ensured the fraudulent Medicare billing codes were highly visible, bolded against the dark background of the slide. The third folder contained the domestic financial trail. This was the pillar designed to expose the systemic familial rot. I uploaded the Delaware clearinghouse routing sequences tracing the offshore hosting payments backward to the regional bank right here in Tennessee. Next, I attached the high-resolution scan of the commercial deed of trust. The document Richard Penn filed using a defunct family trust to secure a variable rate commercial mortgage. I zoomed in on the signature line, cropping the image to emphasize the forged, looping cursive of my own name. My father had committed felony identity theft to bankroll a cybercrime syndicate. This specific document was not meant for the federal authorities. It was meant for the Caldwell legal team. It served as undeniable proof that the corruption extended far beyond the chief executive officer. The entire Penn family hierarchy was legally compromised. They had actively consumed my legal identity to protect their societal optics. The fourth and final pillar was the executioner's stroke. The last piece of the dossier was the synchronization log I had extracted just moments before the firewall slammed shut. I placed the timestamp of Preston's master administrative login directly above the Active Directory housing the ghost servers. The digital footprint demonstrated how he bypassed standard security protocols to delete his petty luxury spa expenses from the Maldives trip. In his arrogant haste to scrub a minor accounting blemish, he inadvertently verified his direct knowledge of the fraudulent architecture. He could not claim a rogue developer installed the bot farm. He could not point the finger at a careless financial officer. The metadata formed an inescapable cage around his own neck. I reviewed the 4 pillars twice, ensuring every file path was accurate and every deduction was supported by raw packet data. I locked the directory behind a dual encryption key. The execution package was airtight clinical and devoid of any emotional vulnerability. I shut down the processing rig. The sudden silence in the apartment was profound ringing in my ears after hours of listening to the mechanical clatter of my keyboard. I pushed the ergonomic chair back and walked to the high-rise window. Dawn was breaking over the Cumberland River. The night sky shifted from a bruised purple into a pale metallic gray. The streetlights flickered off in unison along the interstate below. The city of Nashville was waking up, entirely unaware of the corporate earthquake preparing to detonate within its financial district. The quiet beauty of the sunrise offered a stark contrast to the destruction I was about to unleash. I retreated to my bedroom to prepare for the physical arena. A forensic auditor must present an image of unyielding, sterile authority. I bypassed the comfortable fabrics I usually wore and selected a structured, tailored charcoal suit. The heavy wool blend felt like armor. I fastened the buttons of a crisp white blouse, ensuring the collar sat perfectly crisp against my neck. I pulled my hair back into a severe knot, pinning down every stray strand. I slipped into polished black heels that clicked with sharp precision against the concrete floor. I stood in front of the full-length mirror. I did not see the invisible sister. I did not see the family disappointment who had been shoved into the drafty corner of a country club wedding reception. I saw a sovereign entity. I saw the grim reaper of Silicon Valley armed with the exact mathematics required to balance a ledger 32 years in the making. I unplugged the encrypted tablet from the secure docking station. The solid-state drive felt heavy, dense, with the gravity of consequence. The ticking clock was at 0. The Caldwell acquisition meeting was scheduled to begin in less than 2 hours. I left the apartment, the heavy door locking securely behind me. The descent in the elevator felt like lowering into a gladiator pit. The stainless steel doors parted with a soft chime, depositing me into the ground floor lobby. The space was bathed in early morning light, the polished stone floors reflecting the pale sky outside. I tightened my grip on the tablet and walked toward the glass exit doors. My mind focused entirely on the boardroom. But the physical confrontation I had anticipated arrived early. The shadow I saw detaching from the alcove near the security desk stepped directly into my path, forcing me to halt my progression. The figure blocked the morning light. Richard Penn wore a dark navy trench coat over a pristine suit, his silver hair combed back with meticulous care. Despite the early hour and the undeniable crisis unfolding within his own household, he presented an image of unshakable control. He did not look like a man teetering on the edge of financial ruin or federal prosecution. He looked like a chief executive arriving to close a routine negotiation. The patriarch had not come to wish me a pleasant morning. He had come to defend his crumbling kingdom, setting the stage for a final, desperate ultimatum. "You are up early," Beatrice Richards said. His deep baritone echoed through the cavernous space, rebounding off the polished stone walls. It was the same authoritative cadence he had utilized to govern our household for 3 decades. It was the voice that had dismissed my college acceptance letters as practical but uninspired. It was the voice that had proposed endless toasts to Preston, framing my brother's failures as stepping stones to inevitable greatness. I stopped my progression toward the glass exit doors. I kept my posture aligned, holding the encrypted tablet securely against my side. "I expected a delegation, Dad," I replied, my tone carrying the sterile chill of the morning air. "Sending you alone feels like a tactical error." He offered a tight, patronizing smile and stepped away from the alcove. His leather shoes clicked with a rhythmic, measured confidence against the marble floor. "Your mother is at home," he said. "She is distressed. Your brother is currently trying to hold his life together after your little stunt last night. I came alone because this is no longer a family squabble. This is a business discussion." He was attempting to shift the dynamic. By framing the encounter as a professional negotiation, he sought to strip away the profound emotional weight of his betrayal. He wanted to reduce the impending catastrophe to a simple matter of leverage and compliance, a transaction he could control. I stood my ground, letting the pale sunrise wash over us through the towering windows. There is no business to discuss, I stated. I am scheduled to present my findings to Harrison Caldwell in less than 2 hours. Richard slipped his hands into the pockets of his navy trench coat. He tilted his head, studying me with a look of feigned fatherly disappointment. Preston told me you found some anomalies in the server traffic, he said. He mentioned you were getting worked up over some operational irregularities. I watched the muscles flex along his jawline. He was testing the waters. He was trying to gauge exactly how much telemetry I possessed before committing to a defense strategy. They are not irregularities, I corrected, keeping my voice devoid of heat. It is a fabricated ecosystem. Preston is using a ghost server network to generate synthetic user metrics. He is billing the federal government for phantom telehealth appointments. And the regional shell company paying the offshore hosting fees is being funded by the commercial mortgage you took out on the grandfather trust. The trust you forged my signature to leverage. The patronizing smile vanished from his face. A heavy, stagnant silence fell between us. The ambient hum of the lobby ventilation system suddenly seemed incredibly loud. I had laid my cards on the table face up. I stripped away his plausible deniability. I forced him to look at the exact dimensions of his own corruption. He did not flinch. He did not issue a denial. He simply exhaled a long, measured breath, letting the facade of ignorance drop to the floor. You always possessed a brilliant mind for details, Beatrice, he said, his voice lowering to a quiet, conspiratorial register. You see the raw numbers. You see the ones and the zeros. But your flaw is that you lack vision. You do not understand how the world is actually built. I did not interrupt him. I let him construct his own trap. Nobody starts at the top, he continued, pacing a few steps to his left, attempting to commandeer the physical space of the lobby. Every great empire requires a leap of faith. The technology sector is an ecosystem built on momentum. You project success to attract capital, and you use that capital to build the success you projected. It is a bridge loan on reality. You fake it until you make it. He stopped pacing and turned back to face me, his eyes hard and unyielding. Preston had a brilliant concept. He just needed time to scale. The venture funding dried up before the market could catch on. I provided the bridge to get him to the Caldwell acquisition. When Harrison signs those papers today, the infusion of capital will make the entire company solvent. Preston will hire legitimate developers to build the actual infrastructure. The synthetic traffic will be phased out. I will pay off the commercial mortgage. Everyone wins. He believed it. I could see the terrifying conviction in his eyes. He viewed the wire fraud, the intellectual property theft, the forged signature, and the investor deception as necessary strategic maneuvers. He had insulated his conscience with the delusion that the ends justified his criminal means. It is fraud, I stated, slicing through his twisted monologue. You are tricking a billionaire into purchasing a hollow shell. When Harrison discovers the asset is worthless, he will dismantle Preston. He will dismantle you. Harrison will not discover anything unless you put it on his desk, Richard countered. He took a step closer, towering over me, attempting to use his physical presence to enforce his will. Which brings us to the purpose of my visit. He pulled his hands out of his coat pockets. The negotiation was ending. The ideological climax had arrived. He was ready to deploy the ultimate patriarchal weapon. You have a choice to make this morning, Beatrice, he said, pitching his words with surgical precision, ensuring each syllable carried maximum weight. You can walk into that boardroom and hand Harrison whatever file you are holding. If you do that, you will destroy your brother. You will bankrupt your mother and me. And if you force that outcome, you are no longer a member of this family. He held my gaze, his expression carved from stone. You will be dead to us. Your name will not be spoken in my house. You will be excised from the legacy, stripped of your inheritance, and left to navigate the rest of your life as a stranger. You will have nothing. The threat hung in the cool lobby air. It is the deepest fear ingrained in any child, the threat of total abandonment. He expected me to shatter. He expected the conditioning of my youth to override my professional integrity. He thought the prospect of losing his approval would bring me to my knees. But I did not feel fear. I looked at the man who had just admitted to mortgaging his life and stealing my identity to cover up a federal crime, and I felt nothing but a profound, liberating clarity. The threat of abandonment only works if the target feels cherished to begin with. I had spent 32 years standing in the cold draft of their indifference. I survived their neglect. Their absence was not a punishment. It was a release. Richard let the silence stretch, allowing the threat to settle into my bones. When my expression did not crumble, he offered the bribe, the carrot following the stick. But it does not have to end in a tragedy, he said, softening his tone, adopting the benevolent posture of a forgiving king. Preston recognizes your talent. I recognize your talent. We know you feel overlooked. If you delete that file, if you walk into that room and give Aegis HealthTech a clean bill of health, Preston is prepared to offer you a position. He smiled a genuine, terrifying expression of anticipated victory. Chief Technology Officer of the newly merged division, a 7-figure salary, substantial equity options, a corner office overlooking the city. You will finally have the seat at the table you have always wanted. We will build the future together as a united family. I absorbed the offer, charting the breathtaking, dramatic irony dripping from his words. He was trying to buy my silence, using the very capital he was currently stealing from Harrison Caldwell. He was offering me equity in a company propped up by fake Medicare claims and a forged family trust. He wanted to reward me with a prominent role on a sinking ship disguised as a promotion. You think protecting a federal crime is a business strategy? I said, my voice steady, cutting through the marble acoustics. You think hiding a fatal structural flaw is a display of loyalty. His smile faltered. A liability does not become an asset just because you put my name on the door, I continued. You did not come here to offer me a seat at the table. You came here to ask me to hold the bag when the federal authorities finally come looking for the stolen taxpayer money. Beatrice, he warned, a dark shadow crossing his features. Do not be foolish. I am offering you the world. You are offering me handcuffs, I replied. I am an auditor. My currency is the truth. I turned away from the glass exit doors, pivoting on my heel toward the subterranean parking garage access. I needed my car to get to the Caldwell Logistics headquarters, and I had wasted enough time listening to a phantom king defend a non-existent empire. Where are you going? He demanded, his voice cracking like a whip, the polished facade finally shattering into jagged pieces. I gave you an ultimatum. You walk out that door with that tablet, and you are done. I paused at the edge of the elevator bank and looked back at my father one last time. He stood in the center of the lobby, desperate and fading, watching his perceived leverage evaporate into the morning sunlight. I am the auditor, I said, my voice echoing off the stone walls. My job is to protect the deal. I pressed the call button. The steel doors slid open immediately. I stepped into the polished cab, turned around, and maintained steady eye contact with Richard as the doors slid shut, sealing him out of my sight. The descent into the parking garage began. The final obstacle was cleared. The drive to the execution awaited. The drive from my apartment to the Caldwell Logistics corporate campus took exactly 22 minutes. I utilized the quiet hum of my sedan to compartmentalize the remnants of the lobby confrontation. Richard had fired his final weapon, severing the familial bond with the threat of total abandonment. I walked away completely intact. The emotional variables were now permanently eliminated from the equation. Only the raw data remained secured safely within the encrypted tablet resting on my passenger seat. I pulled into the subterranean parking structure beneath the towering glass and steel monolith. The architecture was designed to project absolute transparency, a physical manifestation of corporate integrity. It was a fitting arena for the execution of a monumental lie. I cleared the security checkpoint, swiping the temporary access badge Harrison provided, and stepped into the silent, high-speed elevator. The digital readout flashed, climbing rapidly toward the executive penthouse level. The heavy mahogany doors of the primary boardroom loomed at the end of a long, hushed corridor. Those doors symbolized the ultimate gatekeeping of the elite. They were the barrier my parents had spent 30 years desperately trying to cross, trading their wealth, their dignity, and eventually their freedom for a seat on the other side. I did not knock. I simply turned the brass handle and walked in. The boardroom was a theater of corporate power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an uninterrupted sweeping view of the Nashville skyline. The morning sun glinted off the glass towers, casting bright, shifting patterns across the polished surface of the massive conference table. In the center of the room, a discreet side console was staged with a dozen crystal flutes and 2 bottles of premium champagne chilling in a silver bucket. The set pieces for a celebration were perfectly arranged. The principal actors were already present. Preston sat near the head of the table. He wore a bespoke Italian suit that fit with immaculate precision, projecting an aura of relaxed, unassailable success. He had clearly recovered from his midnight panic, likely bolstered by the belief that his smear campaign email had successfully neutralized my threat. To his immediate right sat Richard, his posture rigid and commanding, revealing none of the desperation he had exhibited in the lobby just an hour prior. Caroline sat to Preston's left, wearing a vibrant designer dress and a smile so tightly drawn it looked painful. They had been invited for the ceremonial signing, the photo op that would solidify their status in the upper echelons of society. Across from Preston sat Harper Caldwell. Harrison's daughter was not smiling. She rested her hands on a closed leather portfolio, her sharp, intelligent eyes scanning the room. She was the chief financial officer of her father's division, and she carried the quiet, observant energy of a predator scanning for movement in the brush. I walked to the far end of the long mahogany table, the position furthest from the champagne and the cameras, and pulled out a heavy leather chair. I sat down, placed my encrypted tablet on the wood, and folded my hands in my lap. The soft click of my tablet drew their attention. Preston turned his head, his eyes locking onto me. A spectrum of micro-expressions flashed across his face. First, a spike of genuine shock. Then, confusion. Finally, the confusion evaporated, replaced by a slow, spreading smirk of triumphant arrogance. The dramatic irony saturating the room was thick enough to choke on. He looked at me and saw a defeated adversary. He assumed Richard's lobby ultimatum had worked. He thought I was sitting at the far end of the table to witness his coronation and accept my newly assigned, subservient role within his empire. Beatrice Preston said, his voice loud enough to command the room. He infused the single word with a toxic blend of pity and condescension. "It is good of you to come. I know Dad mentioned you might want to observe the signing." I did not reply. I simply watched him. He unlaced his fingers and gestured vaguely toward the heavy mahogany doors. "However, the legal teams are about to finalize the transfer of the intellectual property assets. We are entering the confidential phase of the acquisition. This is a principal-only meeting." He offered an apologetic smile to Harper. "Family is important, but we have to respect the corporate protocols." He was attempting to publicly dismiss me before Harrison arrived, eager to eliminate the only variable he could not fully control. "I need to ask you to wait in the reception area," Preston instructed, his tone hardening from a request into a directive. "We will bring you back in for the champagne toast." I did not move. I kept my eyes fixed on his, letting the silence stretch until his artificial smile began to falter. "I am not asking Beatrice. Please leave the room." The boardroom doors swung open behind him. Harrison Caldwell walked in. The atmosphere shifted instantly, the ambient energy realigning around the gravitational pull of the billionaire. He was flanked by 3 men carrying thick briefcases, the Caldwell Logistics legal counsel. Harrison wore a dark suit, no tie, and an expression of absolute, unreadable calm. He walked to the head of the table. Preston immediately stood up, his irritation vanishing, replaced by eager deference. "Harrison, good morning." He extended his right hand, ready to execute the ceremonial handshake that would initiate the transfer of wealth. "We are all set here. The contracts are ready for your signature." Harrison did not take the offered hand. He looked at Preston's outstretched arm for a fraction of a second, then bypassed him entirely, pulling out the chair at the head of the table and sitting down. Preston's hand hung in the empty space. A flush of embarrassment crept up his neck. He slowly pulled his arm back and lowered himself into his seat, glancing at Richard for reassurance. Richard's jaw tightened. "Before we look at the contracts," Harrison began, his voice dropping the temperature in the room, "I want to clarify a few operational details regarding the Aegis HealthTech network architecture." Preston forced a laugh, leaning forward, eager to reclaim the narrative. "Of course, Harrison. Happy to walk you through the high-level metrics again. The user acquisition flow is fully documented in the executive summary." Harrison raised a single hand, a silent command that stopped my brother mid-sentence. "I do not need the executive summary," he said. "I need the foundational audit." Harrison turned his head and looked down the length of the mahogany table, past the lawyers, past Harper, past my parents, locking his eyes onto mine. "I asked an independent data auditor to run a shadow analysis on the raw packet data," Harrison announced to the room. "The findings were submitted to my secure server early this morning. However, due to the nature of the anomalies discovered, I requested the auditor present the data in person, on the record, before any capital changes hands." Preston froze. The blood drained from his face at a terrifying speed. He looked at Harrison, then turned slowly to look at me. The smirk was gone. The delusion of victory was shattered. The reality of his nightmare was manifesting in real time. Harrison reached into his jacket pocket, produced a sleek black remote clicker for the boardroom projector, and slid it down the polished length of the table. The plastic device glided over the wood, stopping precisely in front of my encrypted tablet. "The floor is yours," Beatrice Harrison said. I picked up the clicker. The plastic felt cold against my palm. I stood up, connecting my tablet to the hidden port in the table. The massive digital screen dominating the far wall flared to life, casting a sharp blue light across the room. I did not clear my throat. I did not offer a preamble. The data required no introduction. "This is the executive summary submitted for due diligence." I began, my voice calm and analytical. The slide displayed a pristine graph showing a steep upward trajectory, claiming an acquisition rate of 50,000 new clinics. I pressed the clicker. The polished graph shattered into raw server logs. This is the reality. I directed the legal team's attention to the cyclical bot farm. I explained the synchronized login times and the flawless mechanical intervals. "These are not human users," I stated, "but they are generating human billing codes." I magnified the payload packets, revealing the fake Medicare claims. Preston pushed his chair back, the legs grinding harshly against the carpet. "Harrison, this is a gross mischaracterization," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the screen. "It is an industry-standard load test. We simulate traffic to stress test the interface. She hacked the system to frame me." The lead legal counsel, a man with cold gray eyes, raised an index finger. "Do not interrupt the presentation, Mr. Penn," he instructed. The command carried the unyielding force of a gavel. Preston sank back into his chair. "A simulated load test does not submit fraudulent medical claims to the federal government," I continued, "nor does it require a shadow corporation to fund offshore servers." I clicked to the next slide. I displayed the financial trail tracing the money from Delaware to the Memphis Shell Company. Then I revealed the origin of the liquidity. The screen filled with the forged commercial deed of trust. I highlighted Richard's name and the forged signature of the grandfather trust. Richard sat paralyzed, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles were stark white. Caroline gasped, covering her mouth with a trembling hand. I clicked to the third pillar, the intellectual property theft. The screen split, showing the core routing engine of Aegis beside my own archived blueprints from 3 years prior. I magnified the hidden developer tag, BP Protocol 0. The algorithmic engine driving this startup was not developed by a visionary founder, I explained. It was extracted from my stolen hardware. "You are attempting to purchase stolen goods." Harper turned her head, her sharp eyes boring into the side of Preston's face. The quiet calculation of the financial officer transformed into the cold disgust of a woman realizing she was marrying a parasite. Preston shook his head, his breathing shallow and rapid. "She is lying," he pleaded, looking at Harrison. "She sent a threatening email last night. She is unstable. I warned your human resources department." I pressed the clicker one final time. "My brother anticipated this audit," I said, addressing Harrison directly. He initiated a preemptive communication, suggesting my findings were the fabrication of an unstable mind. He intends to argue that a rogue developer built the bot farm without his knowledge. The final slide materialized. It was the stark, unformatted server session log. At 1:52 this morning, the Aegis master administrator logged into the core network to alter personal executive expense records regarding a luxury trip to the Maldives, I said. I zoomed in on the signature block, aligning it directly beneath the corrupted directory housing the fake Medicare claims. The metadata confirms the chief executive officer had direct, intentional knowledge of the fraudulent architecture, I concluded. He bypassed standard security protocols verifying the ghost servers himself 7 hours ago. The culpability is absolute. I lowered the clicker. The presentation was over. The execution was complete. The room was dead silent. The indisputable data suffocating the golden child of Nashville beneath the weight of his own federal crimes. The silence in the Caldwell boardroom possessed a physical weight. It pressed down on the mahogany table, suffocating the ambient hum of the climate control system and drowning out the distant, muffled sounds of the Nashville traffic far below. The bright morning sunlight continued to stream through the floor-to-ceiling windows, indifferent to the empire that had just been vaporized. The blue glow of the projector screen illuminated the dust motes suspended in the air, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on my brother's pale face. Harrison Caldwell did not look at the digital display behind me. He did not glance at the premium champagne sweating in the silver bucket. He kept his gaze locked on Preston. The billionaire's expression remained devoid of anger. Anger implies a loss of control, an emotional reaction to a perceived threat. Harrison did not view the man sitting across from him as a threat. He viewed him as a contamination. "The letter of intent is formally rescinded," Harrison stated. His voice was flat, carrying the sterile authority of a judge issuing a final verdict. "The acquisition offer is void due to material misrepresentation, intellectual property theft, and federal fraud during the due diligence period." Preston flinched as if a physical blow had struck his jaw. The bespoke Italian suit seemed to crumple around his shoulders, losing its tailored structure. "Harrison, wait," he pleaded. His voice cracked, pitching upward into a desperate, reedy whine. "You have to let me explain the metrics. I can restructure the network." "There is no explanation required," Harrison interrupted, cutting through the pathetic bargaining. "You attempted to sell me stolen assets wrapped in a synthetic framework. You falsified user engagement to inflate the valuation of a hollow company. And you utilized my resources to facilitate a felony against the federal government." Harrison turned his head slightly, addressing the lead counsel seated to his right. "Contact federal regulators immediately. We are legally obligated to file a comprehensive report with the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as the Department of Health and Human Services, regarding the fraudulent Medicare disclosures presented during our preliminary review." The lawyer nodded once, pulling a sleek smartphone from his jacket pocket to initiate the process. The action was swift and merciless. Preston broke. The polished technology founder persona cultivated over a decade of unearned validation and parental enabling shattered into jagged, irreparable pieces. The arrogance evaporated. He stood up, knocking his heavy leather chair backward. It collided with the glass wall with a dull thud. "No, you cannot do that," Preston begged, reaching his hands across the wide table in a gesture of pure, unadulterated panic. "If you contact the federal authorities, my seed investors will pull out. The startup will collapse. I will go to prison. We can fix this internally. I will license the code from Beatrice legally. We can negotiate a lower buyout price. Just give me a chance to make it right. Do not destroy my life over a miscalculation." Harrison stared at the trembling hands hovering over the polished wood. You destroyed your own life the moment you believed I was foolish enough to purchase a lie, he said. Realizing the billionaire was an immovable object, Preston spun around, his frantic gaze searching the room for a lifeline. He looked at Richard, but our father was staring blankly at the tabletop, paralyzed by the sudden realization of his own impending doom. Preston turned to his left, fixing his desperate eyes on Harper Caldwell. Harper sat perfectly still, her posture impeccably straight. She had not spoken a single word since my presentation began. She had watched the forensic data unfold with the clinical detachment of a seasoned financial officer evaluating a toxic asset. She looked at her fiancé, taking in his sweat-slicked face, his frantic, shallow breathing, and his total lack of dignity. "Harper, honey," Preston whispered, "talk to him. Explain to him that we are family. We can handle this quietly." Harper did not offer a verbal response. She raised her left hand, resting it gently on the leather portfolio in front of her. With her right hand, she grasped the flawless 3-carat diamond engagement ring adorning her finger. She pulled the platinum band over her knuckle in one smooth, unbroken motion. She set the jewelry on the mahogany table. The heavy metal made a sharp, resonant clink against the wood. It was the sound of a closing door. Harper stood up, gathered her portfolio, and walked toward the boardroom exit. She did not look back. She did not offer a tear, a scream, or a dramatic farewell. She excised the liability from her life with the same ruthless efficiency her father used to govern his logistics empire. The heavy doors swung shut behind her, sealing Preston's fate. He stared at the diamond ring resting on the table. The symbol of his ruined future caught the morning light, mocking him. A strangled sob escaped his throat. He sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. The systemic ruin finally breached the threshold of Richard's paralysis. The patriarch blinked his eyes, darting around the room, as the terrifying arithmetic of the fallout calculated in his mind. Without the Caldwell buyout, the massive infusion of capital Preston promised would never arrive. Aegis HealthTech would declare bankruptcy within the week. The Memphis shell company would stop paying the offshore hosting fees. The bot farm would go dark. Most importantly, the variable rate commercial mortgage tied to the forged grandfather trust would default. Richard was not just watching his son's career end, he was watching his own legacy burn to the ground. The bank would seize his assets. The Brentwood estate would enter foreclosure proceedings. The performative wealth, the country club prestige, the carefully curated image of the successful patriarch, all of it was gone. He had bankrupted himself and his wife to protect an illusion, and the illusion had just evaporated. Caroline let out a sharp, ragged cry, finally comprehending the totality of the devastation. Her fragile societal smile dissolved into a mask of pure horror. Tears spilled over her eyelashes, leaving dark streaks of makeup tracking down her cheeks. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a toxic, misdirected anger. "Beatrice, tell them," Caroline shrieked, her voice rising in hysteria. "Tell them you made a mistake with the numbers. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. How can you stand there and watch your family be destroyed?" I looked at the woman who had spent 32 years enabling a parasite while ignoring my existence. "You destroyed yourselves," I replied, my voice carrying no malice, only the cold truth of consequence. "You just handed me the match." Harrison tapped a discreet button on the intercom console set into the table. "Security to the executive boardroom," he instructed. Less than a minute later, the mahogany doors opened. 2 towering security guards stepped into the room, their dark uniforms matching the grim severity of the legal counsel. "Escort these 3 individuals out of the building," Harrison ordered, gesturing toward the crumbling family unit at the side of the table. "Ensure they do not access any secured areas on their way down to the parking garage." The guards moved forward with professional, unfeeling efficiency. One placed a firm hand on Preston's shoulder, hauling the broken founder to his feet. Preston did not resist. He stumbled forward, his eyes glazed, his spirit entirely broken. Caroline followed, weeping loudly, into her hands her designer gown suddenly looking like a tragic costume. Richard resisted for a fraction of a second. He pulled his arm away from the guard's grip, straightening his navy jacket in a desperate, pathetic attempt to retain a shred of dignity. He looked back at Harrison, then looked down the long table at me. The authoritarian king, stripped of his kingdom, staring at the architect who drafted his ruin. He turned and walked out the door. I watched them leave. I did not feel a rush of triumphant adrenaline. I did not feel the fiery satisfaction of revenge. What I felt was clean. What I felt was the structural piece of a balanced ledger. The liabilities had been purged from the room. However, the execution was not entirely finished. I remained seated in my leather chair. While the Caldwell legal team began drafting their federal reports, I unlocked my encrypted tablet. I opened a highly secure legal portal linked directly to the Tennessee State Attorney General and the Regional Banking Authority. Prior to the meeting, I had drafted a cryptographic disavowal of the signature on the commercial deed of trust. The document outlined the exact parameters of the identity theft Richard committed to secure the loan. It formally severed my legal and financial ties to the grandfather trust, citing the fraudulent commercial mortgage as grounds for immediate asset protection. I pressed the submit key. The digital filing transmitted instantly, registering my disavowal across the state financial networks. I insulated myself from the impending blast radius. In a matter of hours, the federal authorities would freeze the Penn family assets. The bank accounts would be locked. The properties would be seized, but my name was clear-scrubbed from their corrupt ledgers mere moments before the financial guillotine dropped. I closed the tablet, the sharp click of the cover echoing the finality of my freedom. The weeks following the boardroom execution unfolded with the predictable, unyielding velocity of a controlled demolition. When a hollow structure loses its primary support pillar, the collapse generates a tremendous amount of noise, drawing spectators from miles around to watch the dust settle over the wreckage. I monitored the fallout from the quiet sanctuary of my downtown Nashville apartment, tracking the variables as they shifted from private consequence to public spectacle. The business sections of the regional newspapers caught the scent of the disaster within days. The narrative escalated rapidly from corporate irregularities to federal criminality. The Securities and Exchange Commission formally announced a joint investigation with the Department of Health and Human Services into the Aegis HealthTech user acquisition metrics and the fake Medicare billing protocols. The climax of my brother's manufactured empire occurred on a rainy Tuesday morning. Federal agents wearing dark windbreakers swarmed his downtown luxury loft. Local news helicopters circled above the skyline, broadcasting the raid across the state. Agents carried out dozens of cardboard boxes filled with hard drives and financial ledgers. Preston was escorted out of the building in handcuffs. The polished technology founder who had commanded the head of the dining room table was required to surrender his passport and face a federal magistrate. The systemic rot I exposed ensured that destruction did not stop at my brother's doorstep. The financial contagion spread upward, infecting the very foundation of the Penn family legacy. When the Memphis Shell Company ceased operations, the true purpose of my father's secret loans became public record. The regional commercial bank that held the variable rate mortgage initiated an immediate audit of Richard's assets. Facing impending default and the exposure of his complicity in a federal wire fraud scheme, Richard attempted to liquidate his portfolio. The real estate market is unforgiving to desperate sellers. The pristine Brentwood estate was forced into foreclosure proceedings. The performative wealth that had defined my parents' entire existence evaporated overnight. Their country club memberships were revoked. The luxury vehicles were repossessed. Moving trucks parked on their manicured lawn, hauling away the remnants of a life built on stolen capital. Every asset Richard had acquired over 3 decades was drained to cover the exorbitant retainer fees of federal defense attorneys. They mortgaged their reality to protect a lie, and the lie had consumed them entirely. I sat at my processing rig, sipping black coffee, organizing the digital documentation of the legal outcomes. The contrast between my current state and the chaos consuming my family was profound. The people who had obsessed over appearances, who had sacrificed my dignity for a photo opportunity, were now splashed across the front pages in utter disgrace. Meanwhile, the invisible daughter remained pristine, untouched by the scandal, observing the collapse from a safe, analytical distance. My smartphone vibrated against the matte finish of the desk. I glanced at the screen. The notification indicated one new voicemail. The caller identification displayed my mother's number. I had blocked incoming calls from Richard and Preston the moment I left the Caldwell headquarters. I left Caroline's number unblocked out of a clinical curiosity regarding how long it would take the primary enabler to pivot her strategy. It took exactly 28 days. I tapped the screen and engaged the speaker setting. The audio quality was sharp, capturing the ragged, exhausted intake of breath before Caroline spoke. "Beatrice, please do not hang up," she began. Her voice was stripped of the melodic practice pitch she used for polite society. It sounded thin, scraped raw by weeks of relentless stress and public humiliation. "I know you are angry. I know we made mistakes. We were blind. We were foolish to put so much pressure on your brother. Your father is a broken man. He has barely left his chair in weeks. We lost the house. The bank is taking everything." I listened to the litany of consequences, my expression neutral. She was detailing the exact mathematical outcome I had predicted. "I am so sorry," Caroline cried, a wet sob interrupting her words. "I am sorry we did not see your potential. I am sorry we let him take credit for your hard work. You are brilliant. You always were. We were just too blind to understand it." The apology hung in the quiet air of my apartment. For 32 years, I had craved those words. I had wanted the people who brought me into the world to look at me and recognize my worth. But hearing the acknowledgement now, filtered through the static of a voicemail, it carried no emotional weight. It was hollow. It was transactional. "Please, Beatrice," she begged, the true purpose of the call finally surfacing. "Preston is facing decades in federal prison. The prosecutors will not offer a plea deal. But Harrison Caldwell holds the leverage. If he withdraws the formal civil complaint, the judge might reduce the sentencing guidelines. You saved his company. He respects you. He listens to you. You are the only one who can talk to him. Please call Harrison. Ask him to show mercy. We are begging you. You are our only hope." The recording ended. The mechanical voice of the automated system offered the options to save or delete the message. I sat in the ergonomic chair evaluating the strategic architecture of her plea. The enabler had finally acknowledged my competence, not because she valued it, but because she needed to weaponize it to protect the golden child one last time. She was asking me to compromise my integrity, to burn the professional capital I had earned, and to shield a criminal from the consequences of his own actions. She wanted me to build a bridge over the chasm they had dug themselves. I reached out and tapped the screen. The icon flashed red. Message deleted. The audio file vanished from the server, erased from existence, with the same cold finality Harper had used when she placed her diamond ring on the boardroom table. The psychological tether was permanently severed. I blocked the number. The ledger was balanced. The following afternoon, I drove to a private executive club in downtown Nashville at the request of Harrison Caldwell. The venue operated entirely on the currency of silence, featuring heavy oak doors, muted lighting, and deeply upholstered leather booths. It was a sanctuary built specifically for the people who actually owned the boardrooms. Harrison was already seated in a secluded dining room overlooking the city. He wore a dark, unstructured suit jacket, projecting an air of relaxed authority. He stood up, offering a respectful nod as I entered, and gestured to the empty chair across from him. We did not engage in trivial small talk. We ordered our meals, and Harrison immediately shifted the focus to the architecture of the fallout. "You performed a surgical extraction," Harrison stated, cutting his steak with methodical precision. "You navigated a highly volatile, emotional minefield without allowing sentiment to corrupt your data. That requires a specific type of discipline, a discipline I rarely encounter even at the highest levels of my own organization." I took a sip of my sparkling water. I simply followed the packet routing, I said. The numbers provided the map. I just read the topography. Harrison set his knife down. He picked up a sleek, black leather folder resting beside his plate and slid it across the polished table. I need someone who can read the topography on a permanent basis, he said. The chief information officer of my primary logistics conglomerate recently announced his retirement. I am halting the external search. I want you to take the position. The offer hung in the quiet air of the private dining room. Inside that portfolio was a C-suite executive title. It came with an equity stake, a corner office, and a 7-figure salary that would eclipse my previous decade of earnings in a single fiscal year. The profound irony of the moment washed over me. Richard had committed identity theft, bankrupting himself and my mother, all to buy his son a brief, fraudulent audience with this exact man. Preston had committed federal wire fraud just to secure a fraction of the billionaire's approval. My family had destroyed themselves trying to pick the lock on the front door of the empire, and now the emperor was sliding the keys across the table to the family failure. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I appreciate the magnitude of this offer, Harrison, I said, my voice steady, rooted in a deep certainty. I understand exactly what this portfolio represents. Then open it, he suggested, a hint of genuine anticipation in his eyes. I shook my head slowly. I cannot accept the position. Harrison blinked, the anticipation freezing into genuine surprise. In his world, people did not decline a seat at his table. May I ask why? He inquired, his tone devoid of offense, carrying only an analytical curiosity. Are the compensation metrics insufficient? It has nothing to do with the compensation, I replied, maintaining unwavering eye contact. It is about the architecture of the role. If I accept the title, I become a component of your corporate hierarchy. I have to manage internal politics. I have to defend my budgets against competing divisions. I have to wear the uniform of the entity. I paused, letting my gaze drift momentarily to the sprawling city below, before bringing it back to the billionaire. I spent my entire life trapped inside a toxic hierarchy, I explained, laying my philosophy bare. I was assigned a role I did not choose, governed by rules designed to extract my value while erasing my presence. I promised myself I would never be owned by another system again. I refused to trade a familial cage for a corporate one, no matter how lucrative the constraints might be. Harrison listened intently, absorbing the underlying logic of my refusal. I am a data systems architect, I continued. I find the broken nodes. I isolate the rot. I fix the structural failures. But I can only do that effectively if I remain outside the blast radius. I prefer the autonomy of the shadows. I prefer to be the mechanic, not the machine. Silence descended upon the private dining room. Harrison stared at me for a long, calculating minute. The surprise in his eyes slowly transformed into a deep, profound respect. He reached across the table and pulled the portfolio back toward his side. You are a sovereign entity, Beatrice, he said, a rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. I can respect that boundary, but I still require your specific diagnostic capabilities. My network is expanding, and I need a mechanic who operates outside the political blast radius. He reached into his jacket pocket, produced a silver pen, and flipped the leather folder open. He crossed out the primary employment contract, turned to the final page, and drafted a series of numbers in the margin. He slid the folder back across the table. An independent consulting retainer, Harrison proposed. You retain your total autonomy. You accept no corporate title. You report exclusively to me, and only when a critical structural vulnerability requires an uncompromised audit. You set your own hours. You dictate your own methods. I looked at the number he had written in the margin. The retainer fee was astronomical, a figure that secured absolute financial independence for the rest of my life. It was not a salary, it was a sovereign grant. I picked up the silver pen resting on the table and signed my name at the bottom of the page. I drove back to my apartment as the late afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon. The traffic flowed smoothly, a functional system operating without friction. I unlocked my door and stepped into the minimalist space. The setting sun caught the exposed steel ductwork, casting long, warm shadows across the bare concrete floors. I walked into my home office and pressed the power button on the primary tower. The fans spun to life with a quiet, reassuring hum. The monitors flared blue, casting their familiar glow across the dark room. The collapse of Aegis HealthTech was chronicled extensively by financial journalists, framed as a modern cautionary tale of technological hubris. But the true story, the one that lives in the quiet, aching spaces between the court filings and the foreclosure notices, is not about venture capital. It is a story about the devastating consequences of parental blindness. When you raise a golden child without accountability, you do not build a visionary. You build a criminal. Richard and Caroline believed that securing Preston's status in the world was their ultimate duty, completely blind to the fact that true parental duty is raising a child who does not need to steal to feel significant. They rewarded performative arrogance while punishing quiet competence. They taught their son that a polished lie is more valuable than an unvarnished reality. The Penn family paid the ultimate price for that inversion of values. Peace is not something you inherit. It is not something you are given by the people who demand your silence. Peace is a structure you build yourself, one honest line of code at a time. Gravity is a relentless auditor. It does not care about your tailored suits. It does not care about your country club memberships or the prestige of your last name. Gravity always pulls down a house built on lies. I pulled the ergonomic keyboard toward my chest, aligned my fingers over the mechanical switches, and pressed the Enter key. The collapse of Aegis HealthTech was chronicled extensively in the financial sections of regional newspapers, framed by journalists as a modern cautionary tale of technological hubris and corporate fraud. But the true story, the one that lives in the quiet, aching spaces between the court filings and the foreclosure notices, is not about intellectual property or venture capital. It is a story about the devastating consequences of parental blindness. When the dust finally settled over the shattered remains of the Penn family, the most tragic casualty was not the loss of their commercial real estate portfolio or the revocation of their country club prestige. The true casualty was the realization that a family had spent 3 decades meticulously building a monument to a lie, entirely neglecting the foundation of character required to sustain it. In American culture, we are often sold a specific, intoxicating version of the dream. We are told to project confidence, to leverage our networks, and to relentlessly pursue the optics of success. The pressure to present a flawless domestic portrait to the neighborhood, the community, and the world at large can feel suffocating. For Richard and Caroline, this cultural messaging became a toxic religion. They looked at their son Preston and saw the perfect vessel for their own unresolved ambitions. They raised a golden child. But in their desperate, unwavering need to see him shine, they stripped him of the one psychological tool every human being needs to survive the real world: accountability. Parenting is not merely the act of providing capital or securing advantageous social introductions. It is the sacred, often uncomfortable responsibility of providing a moral compass. By constantly shielding Preston from the consequences of his failures, by quietly covering his debts and applauding his hollow charm, Richard and Caroline did not protect their son. They disarmed him. They raised a man who knew how to wear a bespoke suit and command a boardroom, but who possessed zero internal architecture. When the storm of reality finally arrived, Preston had no deep roots to hold him steady, only the fragile synthetic scaffolding his parents had purchased for him at the cost of their own ruin. True family responsibility requires fairness, a value that was glaringly absent at the Penn family dinner table. Fairness does not mean treating every child exactly the same, but it fundamentally requires applying the same metrics of honesty, respect, and moral weight to each of them. While Preston was handed the keys to a kingdom he had not earned, I was relegated to the shadows. I was the invisible daughter, the scapegoat, whose quiet brilliance was viewed not as an asset to be nurtured, but as an inconvenience to be hidden. The emotional trauma inflicted upon a child when they realize their worth is measured only by how well they serve a fabricated family narrative is a quiet, enduring violence. I learned to build my own armor, retreating into the cold, predictable logic of data, because the people who were supposed to protect me were too busy worshiping a mirage. My parents failed to recognize that by erasing their daughter to elevate their son, they were denying themselves the profound joy of knowing the most capable, resilient member of their own bloodline. A traditional family structure is often heralded as the bedrock of a stable society, providing a safe harbor in a chaotic world. However, that structure is only as strong as the emotional awareness of the parents steering the ship. Emotional awareness means having the courage to look at your children clearly, not as extensions of your own ego, but as sovereign individuals with their own distinct flaws and merits. It means having the fortitude to tell your son that he has failed, and now he must do the hard work of rebuilding, rather than secretly mortgaging your own future to buy him a fake empire. Richard's ultimate betrayal in the apartment lobby was not financial. It was deeply moral. He confused enablement with paternal love. He believed that securing Preston's status in the world was his ultimate duty as a father, blind to the fact that true parental duty is raising a child who does not need to steal to feel significant. When Richard attempted to bribe me with a fraudulent corporate title, he revealed the total bankruptcy of his value system. He taught his children that truth is a commodity to be bought and sold. That lesson ultimately destroyed everything he loved. Long-term guidance for children demands that we prioritize character over credentials. We must teach them that true peace and genuine success are never handed down on a silver platter or secured through a charming smile. They are earned through quiet, unseen, and often unrewarded labor. When we reward performative arrogance while ignoring quiet competence, we signal to our children that the truth is negotiable. We teach them that a polished lie is more valuable than an unvarnished reality. The Penn family paid the ultimate price for this inversion of values. Their tragedy serves as a stark, unforgiving reminder that gravity is the ultimate auditor of our lives. You can dress a lie in expensive linen. You can introduce it to billionaires. You can defend it with aggressive ultimatums. But eventually, the math will correct itself. The ledger always balances. The stories that resonate most deeply with us are the ones that force us to look in the mirror and question the foundations we are building in our own homes and our own lives. If you have ever felt the silent sting of being the overlooked child, or if you have witnessed the slow, inevitable collapse of a system built on familial lies, you understand the vital importance of speaking the truth. For more stories about navigating the complex, often painful dynamics of family justice, confronting toxic hierarchies, and finding the courage to balance your own ledger, be sure to follow the Luke Vengeance channel. We explore the quiet strength it takes to break generational cycles and the ultimate satisfaction of letting the truth speak for itself. Subscribe, share your own experiences in the comments, and join a community that values authenticity over optics. As the years pass, one has to wonder what remains in the quiet, empty rooms of the Brentwood estate Richard and Caroline lost. The echoes of clinking champagne glasses and practiced laughter have long since faded, replaced by the heavy, immutable silence of consequence. I walk free, unbound by the toxic hierarchy, building a life of undeniable substance and earned peace. But for those who are still caught in the performance, a lingering, uncomfortable question remains. When you look at the life you are constructing for your children, when you evaluate the values you praise at your own dinner table, what are you actually building? Are you laying a foundation of unshakable stone rooted in honesty, fairness, and the quiet resilience to weather the truth? Or are you simply paying for a beautiful, fragile facade, holding your breath in the dark and hoping the wind never blows?